Okay, we are Nelson, acho que é Nelson Marconi. We are resuming the conference, and we're heading to the second session on the financial issues, which is titled Financing Development, Rethinking the Public-Private Mix. And we have it with us Professor Andrew Fischer from the ESS, Netherlands, the Institute of Social Sciences, and at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, Netherlands. We have, and this is a great and a big surprise for us, we have Professor Luciano Coutinho with us because we were trying to get him at all costs, and he was able to respond at the last minute. And so it's a great pleasure to have him with us here. Professor Luciano Coutinho, as you all know, former president of the BNDES, extremely important person in terms of economic policy and economic policy making in Brazil, and my former professor at UNICAMP in my old days of graduate studies. So happy to have you here, Luciano. We also have Professor Ernani Torres, which was also chief economist and director of research at the BNDES, the National Development Bank. We have André Perfeito, which is from the Gradual Investimentos, which is a asset management corporation. So he'll probably give us the so-called market view, or maybe not, I don't know. And we'll have a comment by my good friend Rogerio Sobreira, which was, as I said, formerly with us at Mines, and now is the director of risk. Or risk or returns or finance at the Minas Gerais Development Bank. So without further ado, I will give the floor and the word to Andrew. Andrew, thank you very much.
Well, anyways, while we're setting up, I suppose given that everyone's giving praise to Jan, I can, as I always wanted to say that he's the PhD supervisor I always wish I had, but Fischer in debt, yeah, there. So, but basically, I'm actually probably, I think, in comparison to the other presentations today, taking a bit more of a historical perspective, the longue durée, as they say, and also tying it to some of the discussions we were having yesterday on the developmental states and industrial policy. And so in this sense, tying the discussion of finance to more of a structuralist view of industrial policy in order to understand the dynamics, sort of these systemic historical patterns or in the dynamics of debt and development, to just give some broader perspective on the issues. But in this case, comparing South Korea and Brazil. And I think for those of you who were here yesterday, you'll probably see some of the points raised, I think, by Leonardo in particular, being confirmed by the data in this case. Thank you. With some qualification. At the end, I'll also talk briefly, because I know there's a lineup of very impressive people that I should move aside pretty quickly, but make some comments on China as well. And I mean, why is it relevant? It's we're always, Sir Bresar Pereira gets mentioned a lot, but also Jan Kregel brought it up as well, of the importance of relying on domestic sources of finance. So as a means to cover your foreign exchange needs, you rely on exports to cover your foreign exchange needs, and therefore for your finance you can rely largely on domestic sources of finance. That's the basic argument as far as I understand. Yes, Jan. The problem, of course, is that we have no historical examples of this happening in the post-war period, of any of the cases of late development, probably arguably even pre-war period. And arguably, I would say, not even in the case of China. Even in the case of China, there's an important role of net financial inflows into the economy, especially pre-2000s, I would say, in the 80s and 90s, that needs to be understood. And it's this sort of, I think there's a problem also in in the developmentalism and developmental state literature of characterizing developmentalism as the sort of antithesis of dependency. Whereas I think in the classic studies of dependency by Furtado, for instance, who's one of my inspirations, it was clearly understood that dependency emerges or is exacerbated by developmentalism itself. And it's the conditions of developmentalism that produce the dependency that are critical to understand in order to address that problem. What we see in the historical comparison, particularly of South Korea and Taiwan, I don't have the case of Taiwan here, but they're not distinguished by a reliance on domestic sources of finance. They actually have a more intensive reliance on external finance than even the Latin Americans did in the 60s and 70s. But what distinguishes them is the more generous supply and the more generous terms and the stable supply of, in particular, official forms of finance. And I think this is how it ties into this session, because of their debt load right up into the mid-80s was in the majority official debt. And hence they weren't hit by the rising interest rates the way the Latins were, whereas the Latin Americans, of course, were, I think Brazil, I forget the percentage, but Mexico, I know, was over 80% reliant on commercial debt in the build-up to the '82 crisis. I think Jan was saying it. My sort of, I don't know, we all always emerge into sort of awareness at certain historical moments where certain crises form the basis of our understanding of everything. And for me, it was very much the '82 crisis that is the key moment, and so I always refer to that crisis as my reference point. So this understanding of how dependency is exacerbated by developmentalism is really rooted in, well, in the classic, this is a Cepalista position, of course, of the structural weaknesses of late development. I think Ricardo was referring to this yesterday. But it's basically that latecomer or late industrializers have this import dependence, a strong import dependence, that is exacerbated by the process of industrialization. Or it's also exacerbated by declining terms of trade if you remain specialized in primary commodity exports. But as you industrialize, it gets exacerbated because the process of industrialization itself, it becomes very dependent on intermediate imports and capital goods. And ISI never resolved that, and I think that was the important point that Furtado was making even as early as the 1950s in terms of how ISI models actually were exacerbating this dependency. So basically, the import dependence of late industrialization exacerbates trade deficits even when the country is exporting well. And I'll make a proposition here, just in terms of stating my conclusions at the beginning, in case I run out of time, that I would even argue here that the ability of South Korea to have this massive surge of export to GDP ratio was preceded by an ability to import and to run massive trade deficits. So it's the capacity to export was preceded by the capacity to import, and I think that's a really, really important point. That these classic studies from structuralism emphasize, and I think are still relevant today, although they're clouded by the very complex financial dynamics that the previous panel was discussing. And the other point, of course, is that up until the period that Jan was discussing, trade surpluses typically did not result from developmental processes, but they typically resulted from austerity. So you see this in the Latin American cases. The 1982 debt crisis was a perfect example where Carlos Diaz Alejandro, for instance, pointed out in his famous piece, I think No, We're Not in Kansas Anymore, about how Latin America was very quickly able to generate a trade surplus in the context of the '82 debt crisis by basically slamming on the brakes and sending their economies into deep recessions, because that released the import demand and it hence released the foreign exchange constraint. And this was a typical pattern that had been identified by the structuralists. So, and in this case, foreign exchange becomes the specific constraint as distinct from savings. I mean, we were discussing this just last night with Ricardo, and it's bringing the balance of payments to the center of the story of the understanding of the political economy of development for peripheral developing countries, which is still relevant right now. And the constraint, of course, is structural because it's based on the technological and input characteristics of production and consumption, and hence it's not resolved by either right prices or demand management. Hence, both Keynesian and neoclassical solutions don't resolve the problem, and in many cases they exacerbate the problem. So that's the general analytical framework we're working with. To prove this point, I don't need to do anything other than rely on the balance of payments data. So that's all I'll rely on. And of course, I think hopefully all of you understand the basic, I mean, there was already being referred to in the last panel, the basic identity, accounting identity, whereby the current account must equal the inverse of the capital account, financial account, or more specifically, the trade account equals the inverse of everything else, because everything has to add up to zero, right? It's again I just forgot your name for a second, but the Renzi, is that it? No, Fred, what? Sorry? Yeah, Felipe, you were making that point about how it's not a theoretical proposition, it's an accounting identity. So in the face of these foreign exchange constraints, late industrializers have typically, I mean, this is so generic, I think it's obvious, but they've obviously relied on essentially two strategies. One is to emphasize exports or ISI, and as important scholars of industrial policy have always made the point that the characterization of countries as one or the other has always been a false dichotomy. South Korea was as much practicing ISI as it was practicing export orientation. China has done the same. Brazil, arguably, you would all know that better than me, was also practicing combinations of the two and seeking finance through various channels, FDI, debt portfolio, and of course aid. 10 minutes, okay, thanks. So it's usually a mix of both strategies, and what I would argue as well is that what's critical to understand the political economy of development in each case, it's critical to understand the constraints that countries face in choosing any one of these options. So in the case of South Korea, it overcomes these constraints through huge supplies of aid followed by huge supplies of debt, which was largely official debt. And in the case of Brazil and China, you have two different models of dealing with these constraints. China up to the explosion of surpluses from the late 90s onwards. I'll get into that later, but the important point here, and I think this is, you know, we think of the East Asian model as this massive export machine, which is true. They were very successful in raising their exports. But what is, I think, counterintuitive is the degree to which the South Korean model was based on running these massive trade deficits for about a 35 year period, right up until the mid-80s. And here, and this is just basically the historical structure of the balance of payments of South Korea, taking it from 1953. I had to search a bit for some of the historical data, so I'm missing some gaps and so on. But basically, what you see here in the structure is that this dotted line is the goods, the merchandise trade deficit. So they were running, I mean, the jaggedness of it is partly because of devaluations, because they were consistently devaluing through this period, keeping their exchange rate competitive. But that, of course, changes the valuation in US dollar terms. But basically, they were running these deep, deep trade deficits in the range of, say, you could say, around 10% of GDP through that, right up until the 70s. And then the 70s was a bit more of an unstable period in terms of being able to maintain that, but nonetheless, during critical periods, right up to just before the 82 debt crisis, they were running a trade deficit close to minus 10% of GDP. So the point here is that the South Korean model, as we conceive it, was a massive import guzzler. And as successful as it was in generating exports, it was guzzling imports even faster than it could produce exports. And the success of the model has to be understood. I mean, I think, you know, the data in this case, I mean, it's incontrovertible in the sense that we need to understand the South Korean model in terms of the factors that allowed it to generate these very intense, deep trade deficits consistently over a long period of time, without which the industrial strategy, for all its virtues, probably would have ran aground, right, on financial factors. So then the key question then is to understand what financed this. And in the 50s, of course, it was mostly financed through aid flows. This is grants mostly. And as grants and aid more generally tapered off in the 60s, it was then replaced through debt. First, U.S. debt, Japanese debt, and right up to, I think right up to 1986, its debt was more than half official. And critically, the debt was sustained throughout the 82 crisis when the country was actually more indebted than, say, Brazil. So that's one point. And obviously, underlying the story of Korea is the geopolitical situation. It's obviously the conditions that allowed this to happen were the geopolitical conditions, as Leonardo said, the fact that it was the threat of annihilation, and also the fact that the U.S. was heavily invested in maintaining these regimes, both authoritarian in Taiwan and South Korea. But of course, the point that it raises is that, okay, if we accept where there's a will, there's a way, right? So if we accept that, if we accept the presence of the will, what is the way? Right? And if there is no will, then, well, at least you know the way that you can follow, right? And then how are you then adjusting to the absence of the means to follow that way? The other factor here, of course, again related to the geopolitical circumstances, is the fact that unlike most peripheral developing countries, including Brazil, and China, it was running a services account surplus, which was due to the government services, whereas private services would have been negative by that amount. And the government services, of course, was the Korean government supplying services to the U.S. military in Korea and Southeast Asia, like the Vietnam War and so on. So it's another geopolitical consideration. And also, the green line here, that's actually part of the financial account, but I'm just contrasting it, because this is direct investment, so foreign, and it's mostly gross flows, because there was practically no outward Korean direct investment from Korea up until the 1990s, so the net flows are gross, and basically foreign direct investment was non-existent. And this confirms the point that Alice Amsden has always made, which is basically that the Korean model was debt-financed, it was not financed through FDI, and that allowed them to maintain national ownership of the industrialization process, which is a key point. And then also, as you notice here, we'll compare this one to Brazil later on. Because of the official structure of the debt, the income deficit didn't really plunge that much during the context of the Volcker shock that young Kriegel was referring to. So without much further ado, this is just the financial account. The key point here is this, is that basically the government was explicitly borrowing to cover the trade deficit. That was very clear. And then obviously a lot of the government investment was heavily debt financed and so on. So I'm more focusing in this case on the real side of the debt equation rather than on the financial side, if we make that somewhat artificial distinction. In the case of Brazil, I have to figure out a better way to present the Brazilian balance of payments because it looks a bit like a sort of carnival or something. But what I always find amazing with Brazil is, I mean, obviously the Brazilian economy transforms dramatically throughout this period. It goes through substantial industrialization, et cetera, et cetera. We know the story, you know it much better than myself. But what is interesting is that purely looked at through the lens of the structure of the balance of payments, you end the period, in this case, I have the data up to 2010, with basically the same external structure as you started in 1947. With this lack of transformation. And what I mean by that is by 2010, well, you started the post-war period basically with a goods surplus, which was counterbalanced by as is predicted, as this is what Prebisch was classically identifying, was the tendency to run service deficits because the services is dominated by factor payments to basically transnational, you know, foreign, for the foreign companies control. I mean, a lot of this is royalty payments. It's transport. It's you know, the services. Sorry, I'm running out of time, so I better hurry up. And then, of course, an income account deficit as well, a consistent income account deficit, which is largely profit remittances at this point. And very little aid supporting the model. Well, you have this bulge in age here in the 60s, where you had a brief period where there was a lot of U.S. aid going to Brazil, but it only really ever went up to 1% of GDP. So you had a goods merchandise trade surplus compensated by a income account and service account deficit, leading to an overall current account deficit, which was then financed through capital inflows. Oh, by the way, for the Brazilian data, I've very generously provided the data by Lavinia as one of the co-authors of the book. We've been trying to figure out with Lavinia what exactly in this early period, it would make for a very interesting economic history paper. Maybe we should write it together. But a lot of the financial flows in this early period are dominated by other operations in the other financial flows category. So it's not loans. So I was speculating it could be cash and deposits, or it could be bonds, or it could be what was it again? Arrears. Yeah, arrears. We're not exactly, but in somehow it's reflecting the particular adjustment mechanisms of that period. But the point is that you end up with basically the same structure in 2010, where you have a goods surplus compensated by a services and income account deficit, leading to a overall current account deficit. Which is compensated then by capital inflows, half of which are paying off this deficit and half of which are being put into reserves. Essentially, that's more or less the story. And what's interesting here is that throughout this entire period of Brazilian history, the only time you go into actually a sustained trade merchandise good deficit was during the famous, what do you call it, the marcha forçada, and it was only very brief. I mean, it was only very briefly reaching about half of what Korea was running for a 30-year plus period. And then it very quickly ran out of steam and had to be corrected. And also the important point too is that instead of the merchandise balance being compensated by, or the deficit being compensated by services and aid and so on, it's actually the current account is, so in the Korean case, if you go back to the Korean case, the overall current account is in a better position than the merchandise trade deficit, where it's the opposite relationship in Brazil, because it's constantly, the ability to import is constantly being undermined by your deficits on the income account and services account and so on. And of course, so during this period, the reason they were able to run these deficits nonetheless was because of the generous, as we know the story, the generous supply of finance for this period, which came to a smashing halt with the 82 debt crisis, or slightly delayed, because I think, as Jan, you were saying, how Volcker told them to keep lending for a slightly longer period, and then it becomes this very messy situation that you guys were talking about. So I don't need to mention, but it's just to say that, and of course, well, for Brazil, I probably don't need to say much more because I'm running out of time. Because I think probably what you're more interested by is actually one or two comments on China, if I may, yes? But in this case, this is just proving the point here, what I said at the beginning, is that this is the exports and imports as a percentage of GDP. So the dotted one is imports and the bold one is exports. And this is comparing Brazil, which started the period actually as more trade-oriented than Korea. But what's critical is that Korea was having this ability to import more or less at the same level as Brazil because of aid and then debt, whereas Brazil was always constrained basically by what it could earn through its exports in terms of what it could import, and always running against these constraints. So you're having like basically periodic crises punctuating the whole 50s and 60s, as you know. And whereas in South Korea, you see this massive surge in exports being preceded by about 5 years by this massive surge in imports as a percentage of GDP, which was only sustained through the availability of this stable and types of concessional and non-concessional official debt, and a growing amount of commercial debt as well. But in the 70s, Korea was taking on more and more commercial debt, and then I think made it through the 82 crisis through a resupply of official debt, which was much more generous in conditions than what was supplied to Latin America. In the case of China, I just want to make a basic point about China, because I think this is perhaps a misunderstanding with China, is that in China was up until the mid-90s, it was behaving in a very similar peripheral late industrializer fashion, in the sense that every time the economy started to accelerate, it went into, this is more general, this is very, very sort of general data. As the economy started to accelerate, it went into deficits, which in the Chinese context at the time, with very little, large economy with very little supply, limited supply of foreign exchange, basically had to correct quite rapidly. And so applied the brakes, applied austerity, put on the gas again, and then went into deficit. And then this is, of course, 1989. Part of the economic story surrounding the events of Tiananmen Square was the fact that basically they were applying austerity at the time. And then they put on the, they basically, with austerity, they generate a surplus. And then as they basically let off the brakes and start growing again, they go back into a deficit. And it's at this point, in 1992 in particular, that they then allow this massive surge of FDI into the economy. And I think this is just to make one point here, in the Brazilian case, what's interesting is that the dependency authors were emphasizing the role of FDI that undermined the ISI model in the Latin American countries, especially Brazil, in the sense that transnational corporations came to dominate the key strategic industries, the more lucrative strategic industries of the ISI model, and that's what effectively undermined. This is the story of Furtado and Sunqual, for instance, right? And that was done. If we accept that argument, that was achieved on the basis of net inflows of FDI of about 1% a year of GDP. 2 minutes, okay. Whereas if we look at the Chinese case, the levels of FDI from 1992 onwards surged to about 5% of GDP. So China actually went through a period of net FDI flows. I believe that's net. Yeah, that's net. Net is the red. Of net FDI flows in the range of 2 to 4 to 5% of GDP, which was actually only those levels were actually only witnessed in the Brazilian case in this brief surge of FDI inflows that happened in the late 90s around the privatization that somebody was talking about yesterday. So in a comparative view, I mean, the FDI inflows going into China were massive, right? The key difference between Brazil and China is that the FDI inflows in Brazil, at least in the earlier historical period, were focused on the domestic market, as we know, whereas in China, they were concentrated in the export sectors. So that's part of what explains this massive, in the 2000s, this massive surge in the trade surplus. But again, the other part of this story in China, which I think is not really recognized, and I've tested out these arguments with Yu Yongding, who's a Chinese economist who I highly respect, and he's basically confirmed my analysis, which is that basically you have this two phases of the transformation of the trade of the export and the ownership structure of exports and the trade surplus in China. In the 1990s, what essentially happened is you have this rapid increase in the foreign invested enterprises, most of which are fully funded foreign enterprises, in exports. So they rise from 1990 from about, I think, 13% of total exports to almost 60% by 2005, and then it stabilizes at that level. And in 2000, I remember reading the UNCTAD Trade and Development Report in the early 2000s, and they were arguing that this foreign-owned export component was generating very little value added because it was doing this export processing that Robert Raid was talking to us about yesterday. And hence they accounted for a very small share of the trade surplus, which in 2000 was not a very large trade surplus either. But what happened is between 2000 and 2008, 2009, when you had this big surge in this sort of second post-dot-com bubble surge in financial inflows into China that preceded the surge on the trade surplus by 2 to 3 to 4 years, is you had basically the nature of these financial foreign-owned enterprises in the export sector transformed, and they came to dominate not only the exports but also the trade surplus. So when the trade surplus was booming to about 8 or 9% of GDP, about close to in 2009, close to 2/3 of it was accounted for by foreign invested enterprises, about 80% of which were fully owned foreign funded enterprises. Now, people will always say, oh, Chinese data, you know, a lot of this is actually Chinese investors doing round tripping, sending their money out and coming back as foreign investors to take advantage of favorable terms and so on, which possibly accounts for, depending how you estimate it, 25% of these of the foreign FDI. But nonetheless, the point is there's a dramatic, even taking that into consideration, these structural trends are so dramatic that we're seeing a very major transformation of the export sector in such a way that what basically happens is that I'm almost done. What basically happens is that China's main means of earning foreign exchange comes to be dominated by foreign invested enterprises, and then the other ways of obtaining foreign exchange on the financial account, of course, are by definition owned by foreigners, to the extent that they're real foreigners and not Chinese people round tripping and doing other things like that, and so actually puts the Chinese government in quite a vulnerable situation where they're balancing on one hand between accumulating reserves, but then actually having foreign claims on domestic assets, and then also issuing a lot of sterilization bonds into the domestic financial sector in order to mop up the liquidity that's created by the twin surpluses and so on. And so the point is, Yu Yongding makes this point, is that a large proportion of China's reserves do not represent Chinese savings in that sense, right? And it actually puts China into quite of a vulnerable situation, which I believe the government is very aware of, and is carefully trying to navigate this situation, arguably much more skillfully than the Brazilians have. But nonetheless, it is still, you know, if we try and understand these exceptional circumstances of the Chinese experience in the last 10 to 15 years, it still is expressing aspects of vulnerability that are more peripheral in nature rather than a central economy as in the US or Europe, the way we would understand external imbalances in that way. So as conclusions, developmentalism itself generates a need for Forex, redeems concessional public debt financing for developing countries when supportive or at least tolerant of state-led industrialization strategies, and without penalty for trade deficits, which goes against a lot of the mainstream consensus right now, as in, you know, private commercial financial markets will tend to penalize countries for running deficits. Yeah, which is my point. The current context is obviously not ideal for this, but at least we need to understand the lessons. If ever, given the current context, it's sort of an idealistic, you know, if the world would be a wonderful world and we could do what we want, this is probably what we need to do, but we're far from that and we're probably moving backwards. And then as just the last point on the debt question, I just recalling Arthur Lewis's famous assertion that debt actually, as long as you can manage it, preserves sovereignty. Right? Preserves national ownership of your industries, which is exactly what the South Korean case proved. Obviously, it had these special, unique geopolitical circumstances that allowed for that, but the principle nonetheless remains. Whereas, of course, he was very critical of FDI in that sense, which this story also confirms. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Okay, good afternoon all. First of all, I'd like to thank the sponsors of this seminar for the invitation. It's a wonderful opportunity to share with you some of results of our research work, as well as to see again some old friends I haven't seen for a long time, maybe too long time. I haven't seen them. This is a panel about public and policy mix, private and public mix. So what I'd like to discuss here is public and policy mix in long-term corporate finance in Brazil, what happened. And let's see what's happening on and some of the perspectives that we can see. If we could look backwards, 10 years or maybe a little bit more ago, long-term corporate finance has always been a public issue in Brazil. Government has always provided long-term fund in Brazil. The reasons, well, there were some reasons why that at that time. It was not an unusual situation, particularly in Latin America. But one, credit was scarce. The relation of total credit to GDP was under 30%. Second, macroeconomic environment was quite unstable, so lack of confidence to use financial mechanisms. Interest rates were extremely high. Brazil has always lived with high interest rates since Collor de Mello, but we're talking about 12.5% real terms. I say it's quite high anyhow. There was insufficient regulation. Okay, maybe I wouldn't agree with that, but that's part of what's said. And there was an incomplete fiscal adjustment, so that's why we didn't have a long-term market and at that time the public debt market was coming, but it was not there already. I was a little bit astonished about some months ago when I read the interview of the new president of the NDS, and she was talking about the Brazilian situation in long-term capital. And she said a very interesting thing. She said that the entrepreneur was going to make the investment anyway about the past, and only replace the more expensive source of finances with a cheaper one. And the investment rate did not rise. So, investment is not related to interest rate at all. And there is a private sector there that could supply it, maybe a little higher, but that wouldn't put the investment down. And due to that, from her point of view, what she is going to do in office is to grow BNDES as a financier, which is the one that exists, but opening up more and more space for the private sector. The bank is going to fund a much more smaller share of projects than it did in the past. I found that extremely curious because differently from what I'm going to show here, what is she looking at? What reality, what private sector is there? So I'd like to discuss with you and try to find out what she is looking in and what we have developed of a private market source of funding from 10 years from now. When you look to the overall figures, well, something really happened. The last panel had already mentioned it. Credit has increased a lot in Brazil. As a matter of fact, Brazil was on the fastest growing credit market in the world during this period. We had the same size, relative 30% of the GDP, and we came up to 70%. It's the World Bank's figures, which is the average of the high-income countries. So, credit is not scarce. It's not scarce as it was in the past. So maybe she has something, maybe she is right. Everything is included, not only banks, but it's BNDES, everything. All financial institutions. This is the World Bank's data, okay? However, when we look to banks, so let's split. Let's look to banks, let's look to each one of the segments of the market. When we look to banks and the corporate sector, the picture that comes up is not that's so stimulating in terms of private sector. The blue line is what they call non-earned, non-earmarked credit, or free credit, as they call it here. Or the red one is the earmarked credit for corporations. Making it simple, BNDES is the red line, mostly. And private banks and commercial banks are on the other line. What we see, it's interesting, is that most of the growth of credit, bank credit, to corporations during this period, 2005 on, came from earmarked credits, from government supplying credit for corporations. The private banks or commercial banks as a whole, they have stopped increasing their share of the market since 2008. There are some reasons for that, and 2002 on as well. There are a lot of reasons why they did that, and the last thing I'd like to mention here on that slide is that there is a complementarity between those two curves. Long term is, on corporate, is the earmarked credit is long term, it's BNDES. The other is working capital. It's working capital, okay? mostly is working capital for corporations. So they are in a sense complementary, and it's not really long-term or both. But, well, as a matter of fact, corporations get credit from public sector, not from private sector. But maybe we're missing something. Why? Because a lot of the money that is disbursed by BNDES is done through private banks or through commercial banks. It is what they call indirect operations or indirect loans. So they are on the red curve as well. So maybe they have pushed the market, and we don't see it because we see just the BNDES funding. So we have to open it. When we see it, private sector is not there as well. You know? As a matter of fact, since 2014, they have decreased their share. Usually it's half and half, historically. Half is direct BNDES, half is commercial banks. This changes a little bit, but it has come down largely after 2014. So it was not their increasing the share on BNDES funding. They were, as a matter of fact, some way retreating from the market since 2012 or 2014, depending on what we are looking at. Okay, the bank loans were not there, but maybe capital markets. It's much more than that. We use capital markets instead of, you know, this is what happening all over the world, capital markets in Brazil. Let's see what happened with the capital markets. So the figures here are debentures. Debentures is theoretically only corporation, but not only theoretically, legally, only corporations can issue debentures in Brazil. Because of that, they had some tax benefits using this compared to banks. So when we look at the big figures, well, there is something there. It increased it from 4% of GDP to 12.5% of GDP. This is, well, a little bit more than BNDES. So it's private, I think, capital markets really came in. But there is a very interesting puzzle when we look really at the figures. This is the blue part of it. Leasing companies had 2/3 of the whole market. Wow. There's not such an experience like that anywhere else in the world. This is Brazilian. This is jabuticaba, okay? So we have to watch and see why leasing companies are so important in long-term finance in Brazil. And the answer is very, very easy to find. It's that. This is not corporate finance. This is bank finance. As banks are not allowed to issue debentures with the benefits of issuing debentures, they use their subsidiary leasing company to issue it. They issue, the banks buy it. The money comes back through the interbank market, so this is just paper. And they sell it to the clients with the tax benefits and also the benefits on having to make deposits at the central bank. Very efficient. But it's not corporations, okay? Okay? It's a CD. They call it CD debentures. It's a CD way. It's a very efficient. Central bank allows it, use it to allow. Well, now they are trying to scratch it up, but it's something I'll talk a little bit later. So 2/3 of the market we saw, it's a mirage. There's nothing. Okay. So let's see and it's quite a large amount of money. So say CD debentures is as large as long-term. LF is letras financeiras is long-term bonds from the banks is as large as CDs. So we're talking about a large amount of money that the banks can get to fund their short-term operations, as we saw. So let's look to the rest. Okay, there is a market here. Oh, there is some kind of private market here working. Yeah, we think so. And I made the red part of it, which is a quite new market. It's a tax-free debenture market that is only the benefit is only for householders. Not the banks cannot get the benefit. So it's a very interesting market because we see everything. There's liquidity. There is secondary market. There's a lot of people on one side, a lot of companies on the other side. It's small, but it's increasing fast. What is the yellow? Yellow is a bank loan. What is that? It's it's not efficient to provide long-term loans through banks' balance. The only bank that does it is BNDES, for a lot of reasons. What the banks do is, instead of keeping it on the books, they securitize it, sell it to the market with a guarantee, firm guarantee, that if the market doesn't buy it, they will buy it. They usually buy it all. And they use this paper, these bonds, on their own benefit, but also for the clients, us. Investment funds, or it's a very efficient way to do it. Why? Because liquidity, you can throw it around the conglomerate, here, there, they go around. It's less costly in terms of taxation, and also better in terms of deposits at the central bank. But it's bank loans. It's not market. The real market in Brazil is the 0.4% I'm talking about, okay? So the question really comes up. It's a very interesting market if you get the figures. For example, the average size in tax-free debentures is much larger. Households are half of the market. You have liquidity. Everything that the banks always said that we don't have in Brazil because of structure. No, it's there. But the banks cannot take control of it. Once they lose the control of it, you come up. It's a normal market like anywhere. It's not. This was one of the reasons, for example, that in January this year, there was a law proposed by the government to destroy it, to cancel the benefit. Okay? It's small, but it's scratching. Okay? So it's hurting, but it's interesting. So what I did is I came up, get all the figure and said, what is the real size of the long-term market in Brazil? From the funding, those who provide funds, but also from those who originate operations, okay? Also, so have the command in terms of creating credit and those who fund it. And it's a very interesting situation. From the funding side, BNDES is 2/3 of the market. But there is a private market coming, it's true. 30% is private already. But in terms of origination, creating credit, the control of the private sector is much larger. BNDES is very important on very long-term operations. But from the total amount of money, it's about a little less than half, or 35%. Other investors are mainly investment funds which are not managed by banks, institutional investors, and others. Okay, so what is the president of BNDES seeing? What is she doing? As a matter of fact, when she decides not to fund and to lower the participation of BNDES in new investments, she is throwing new investors into a more costly interest rates. It's the instead of the blue line, it's the gray line. Okay, so we increase the cost of investments during a recession time, as we have here. Investment is already down, so BNDES doesn't have any lack of money. It's structural. BNDES always get extremely liquid during times of recession. When I was at BNDES in 2005, we did a research on that, and self-liquidity, which means disbursement versus what BNDES gets from interest and amortization, 107% because of that. So it's a very good asset portfolio. Everyone pays BNDES. There are a lot of reasons for that. People companies stop paying taxes, but they keep on paying BNDES because it's the lender of last resort. Okay, you just scratch it down when there is no way out, but it's there. So it's interesting. This also they are doing that in the moment that the market, as Jan Krego said or Felipe has already said, very dire situation. Okay, Estado de São Paulo published it yesterday, a small note saying that there is 400 billion reais on NPLs, non-performing loans. Just that. This is almost the size of the balance sheet of BNDES. The banks are dealing with that. I asked myself, the former president of Banco Pactual yesterday about that. He said to me, no, don't worry. We had a wonderful central banks, and the banks can do a good job. Okay, okay. Believe it or not, that's what he told me yesterday. Okay? And as Jan Kregos, I think, said, the figures of 2015, it's a Ponzi scheme already, except for that year. It's going to get better this year because the exchange rate came down. There's a lot of impact of the exchange rates in the balance sheet of the company. But anyhow, as that. So, what's happening? Well, this is disbursements of BNDES along this year. Okay? This year, I expect 92.5 billion reais disbursement, which is about half of 2012, 2013. The question is it demand or is it supply? Well, investment came down, sure. So there is a lot of demand. But from my point of view, there is a lot of supply. The government has decided to cut the disbursement of BNDES as a policy. I have followed up some corporations trying to get money from BNDES along this year, and it was extremely hard. The reasons, well, credit, there was a big change in the way people work, but they paralyzed. BNDES has been paralyzed in a very crucial time, completely different from what happened in 2008. The reason that we are paying 8% of GDP on interest rates, this is the public debt. Interest rates are extremely high. I mean real interest rates there. So they want BNDES to get cash to pay part of the interest rates of the public debt. In terms of flows, this is what they are doing. Okay? So if you look to some of the papers in the last few years, they said that instead of paying only 40 billion reais, they are paying 100 billion to the Treasury. This is paying about a third of the bill of interest rates of the public debt this year. Okay? This is about 6 times the tax-free, all the tax-free market, I mean in terms of debentures. This is about 15% of BNDES all, which is not small. But this is only about 3% of the public debt. So they are shorting a mosquito, okay, in my opinion. Just to end up, and I think what are the perspectives for next future? One, long-term markets is going to shrink fast. Central bank has prohibited banks to keep CD debentures on their balances. They will have to scratch it all until the end of 2018. They have to issue other papers instead, so it will take a little bit of time. But when we look at the figures, we're going to see that coming down very fast, and 2/3 of it is going to disappear. BNDES is going to lose a lot of the size it has in the moment. From my point of view, the government is doing some very strange fashion of fiscal dominance. BNDES has always has protected companies, investors, from the rate of the central bank and the monetary policy. Now it has been subordinated to monetary policy explicitly. And people, government has no other tool in the absence of BNDES. It doesn't have any other tool to use as a substitute to provide further investments. And we will probably going to face a very hard time next year if it doesn't change the environment in terms of financial fragility, not only for the companies, but eventually for the banks as well. Thank you for your attention.
Good afternoon. I want to thank first for Ernani and also Felipe Rezende for the kind invitation for me here. And I may say that I'm strained in the nest because I'm not an academic economist. I work in the market. I work in a brokerage house called Gradual Investimentos. And there is a strange thing with me, so to speak, that I'm a heterodox economist in an orthodox market, and that's why. Yes, sometimes it's very easy to make money, but it's very frustrating also. It's strange to work in the markets. And what I'm going to show to you, it's my impressions about what happened in Brazil, what are the economic, the title say, the economic consequences of the real. Needless to say that I'm Keynesian economist. And in my job, I'm a sell-side economist, and I work with forecasts. My main job is forecasting, and also talk with clients and also with the media about my forecasts. And I participate a lot in the meetings in the Brazilian Central Bank and also with our finance minister to talk about the market conditions, what's going on. And I'm, as someone that believes that the Keynes hypothesis is more likely to be true than the others, I need to say that I need to know very, very well what's happening in the market consensus all the time. And sometimes it's a little bit nonsense that I hear over there, but that's my main job. That's why perhaps I was invited for this meeting. It's really a pleasure for me. So what I'm going to tell you right now, it's my main hypothesis, that they have some economic issues that we need to understand to fully understand what happened in political terms in Brazil. And my main hypothesis is that the maturation or the maturation of the Real plan, the stabilization plan, delivered a very low interest rate in Brazil that made a shock with the conventional consensus about what is risk-free in Brazil. So this presentation will have two parts. The first part, I'm going to tell some hypotheses that the orthodox give to the Brazilian economy, why it happened to Brazil, why we're right now in a crisis. And I'm going to talk about these hypotheses about the lowering interest rate in Brazil and what happened. So first, this is what Laura was saying, that I divide the economy, the GDP, Brazilian GDP, in 4 phases. The first one is the good old times, as Laura said, and you have a very sharp period in the crisis. Then we have between 2010 and 2013 a strange period, and then after 2014, needless to say what happened with Brazil, the real GDP. So the first orthodox view that explanation that we had a boom between 2002 and 2008 with the commodity that delivered a very fast growth in Brazilian economy. So the government have nothing to do with that. It was crystal clear that Brazil would grow in this period because the commodity boom. And then they have an argument also that we made a lot of bad policies in Brazil that created a fiscal imbalance in Brazil. So let's examine the first one. For sure, it's the period, the yellow area. There it's the good old times. You have the commodity price index, the CRB, and also the price of oil. It climbed very fast in this period, for sure. Then you need to understand how this improvement in the price of commodity have an impact in Brazilian economy. And if you see the GDP, that's the GDP index between 1996 and 2016, and for sure between 2002 and 2008, we had improvement in the exports in the GDP, and also, but right after we have a very sharp increase in imports also. The problem here, see that it's not very true that the Brazilian economy is so commodity driven, so to speak. That's my hypothesis, and I'm going to show why that. First one, if you see the first period here is 2002, 2008, and then you have the other periods that I show in the first slide. Here in this period, you see that imports between 2002 and 2008 was what grew faster than the others. You have this, exports here in blue line, and in purple you have investments. What delivered good growth from Brazil in this period was investments. And you need to understand why that happened in this period. One of the why I do believe that, because it's important, especially for a foreign audience, perhaps, that when the orthodox economists say that, oh, what happened in Brazil was a boom in commodity, that they are try to make a political fight with the previous government and say, oh, you don't have any, you didn't create that. It was a miracle, so to speak. And what I'm showing here is not that true, that. And also, if you make a regression with the components of the Brazilian demand, the household consumption is the main factor explaining the Brazilian GDP, and net and exports and imports is very little. It's not that important as we might see here. But we have other question here that if you see the trade balance to the GDP that are EMF data in the World Economic Outlook, the import and export of Brazil to the GDP is one of the lower of all. If you have Poland, South Korea, Mexico, Chile, that example for everyone in Brazil, all the time orthodox economists want to show what we need to do, they talk about Chile. It's very simple economy, Chile. I'm not trying to say anything bad about the Chilean economy, but the reality is that they export copper. That's their job, so to speak. And in Brazil, we have a very diversified industry, and perhaps that explains somehow this very low participation of export and imports to GDP in Brazil. But more important than that, if you see the terms of trade, between 1975 and in 2016, during the boom of commodities, okay, you have an increase in the price of commodities and CRB and oil show that as, but the terms of trade, as that's a data from FUNSEX, it shows it was not the brighter moment of our history, if you see terms of trade. So the first question that they say that, okay, it was a boom of commodity, and then it ended the boom of commodity. Matter of fact, after this period, 2002, 2008, we had a very sharp increase in our terms of trade because our real get weaker against US dollar. So that's explained part of this movement. But okay, that doesn't work for me, this explanation for the Brazilian economy. What was the next explanation for the Brazilian fatality or this crisis? That we made bad policies and it delivered a very bad fiscal result. This 10 minutes already. This graph is saying it all for me, and that's why I do believe that the PEC, this project that they're going to approve, we are living a very sad moment in Brazilian economy and society also. If you see what happened yesterday when the Supreme Court did, it's quite amazing. And I know I lost a lot of money yesterday, so to speak, because I did believe that the Supreme Court could make what makes sense. Okay, but we talk later with beer and try to understand what happened there. But here, again, here are total expenditure of the central government in blue line. The red line is the net income that we need to calculate to have the primary balance. We have here above the line. So what happened in the Brazilian economy? Okay, I can buy it that we had an increase in our expenditure throughout the years. It's have somehow this aspect. But what happened to make deficits in Brazilian government was the income, the net income just stopped to growing. What they are saying to us with PEC, this reform that they are doing, that they want to put this blue line in the same level of the red line. It will not happen. They are going to increase the taxes somehow in the future, in the near future. They are going to approve the PEC, they are going to approve the retirement reform, and then they are going to say, oh, for sure need to increase the taxes because it's not working. I'll talk about the not working. I talked with Luciano and Felipe Rezende before the presentation. I was in a meeting, with some market economists in the finance minister. And what they are saying right now, the market economists, is that Dilma Rousseff and Lula did so much damage in the Brazilian economy that the potential output of Brazil is negative right now. They are saying that we need to destroy capital to reconstruct capital. I don't know how to deal with that. I left the meeting, during the meeting I said, okay, don't have anything to say, so I walk away. But again, I do not believe that they're going to put this blue line in the same level of the red line. It's my feeling about this graph. See. What is strange about the Brazilian economy? If you see the median primary surplus between 2007 and 2013, EMF data, it's not my forecast, and not my data also. You see Brazil had the biggest primary surplus, more than advanced India, Poland, South Africa, Chile. We had the biggest surplus. But more important, between 2014 and 16, this period of crisis, very serious crisis in Brazil, Brazil is here right now. They are forecasting. It won't be that. It will be greater than that. But you see, you have Chile, you have the median of emerging economies, low economies. You have what was the India and Russia. Russia, it's outstanding what they are doing. And if you see the EMF forecasting for primary surplus between 2017 and 2021, Brazil is here. It's not the end of the world, as we are saying, for the Brazilian fiscal situation. So now I'm going to try to make it fast. Why I do believe that we are living in so much economic nonsense right now? And it is important because in the Gradual investment where I work, we have a lot of private credit. I deal with that all day. What's my explanation for that? That's the economic consequence of the real. I said unconscious speak because it's so amazingly crazy what we're living right now that I'm not reading economics more. I'm reading Freud really by heart, Sigmund Freud a lot. But what I see, I'm Keynesian. There are two equations that I need to all the time say: marginal efficiency of capital, the prospective return over the interest rate, and the zero coupon bond. It's a simple formula, no big deal with that. What happened in Brazil? This graph showed it all. Here in Brazil, here we have between 2005 and 2016, as October 2016, the real interest rate, but it's an ex post. I got the interest rate risk-free of these economies and minus inflation. Simple as that. Yeah. Needless to say that the red line is the Brazilian line here. And we have Brazil, Chile, Mexico, Colombia, Indonesia, Chile. In 2005, the real interest rate in Brazil was about 12%. It starts to drop, and the drop of real interest rate is a consequence, in my opinion, of the maturation of the real plan. We built some institutions. Everybody in the market believed that the system, the inflation target system, could work, and start to drop. In 2012, we reached the lowest level ever. That was 1.4% of real interest rate. Well, to say now we are leading again. The real interest rate. First thing, as I said, I work in the financial market. I need to say that when we are in 2005 situation, that we have 12.3% of real interest rate, everybody in the financial market, in the financial industry, are genius. Because it's so easy to make money that nobody needs to even got any risk. We don't need to go to risk when we have 12% of risk-free real interest rate. When it starts to drop and it reached in 2012, 1.4%. We need to remember that the Selic rate started to, because the central bank started to cut in August 2011, and we reached 1.4% in 2012. We need to go to the risk. Simple as that. Everybody say that we as economists, we believe that it's a very smooth movement between cutting interest rate and making investments. It's not that true for sure. And what happened that we had a very low interest rate, 1.4%. What I'm saying here is, again, it's very simple what I'm trying to say. When we drop the interest rate, the central bank are by open market operation are buying bonds. When they buy bonds, the price climbs. When the price climbs, the yield drops. Simple as that. Me as a central bank give money for a society and for investors. The investors start looking for yield, so to speak, and the price of other assets climb, and their yield starts to drop. When we drop the interest rate, the risk-free interest rate, we are dropping all the yields of the economy at the same time. That's the fact that we want. We want inflation of assets. And in Brazilian case, it's very difficult to do that, and I show some data here. When you can see this phenomenon by many ways. Here's the house price index between 2008 and 2016. São Paulo, Rio de Janeiro. São Paulo, blue line, Rio de Janeiro, red line. It was about 60. Then reached between 2014 and 200. So it had a substantial climb in this asset. Why everybody was buying houses, homes in Brazil? There was some house, someone that needed to live in it, but everybody was everybody was buying house for the investment. And why? What's the logic about this investment? If you see the rent yield, rental yield, so it's the rent price over the property price, you have a yield of this investment. When the price of an asset climbs, the yield needs to drop in ceteris paribus. These magic words that all time works. And that's what happened. The rental yield between 2008 to 2016 dropped very fast. So what I'm saying here, as a market economist that work in industry, that making money in Brazil is more difficult. Period. You want to make money, you need to go to the business. It's very strange that I came here to Rio de Janeiro to talk with some assets. They are all in the same square in Leblon. They're in the same square near Jopi. That's a very good bar. And I come there all the time with products. Many times I went there with some private credit products. And they look at this limit, how to say that? The prospectus of the booklet of this financial product. They say, oh, I like it very much, right? But I can't, what they are not saying to me is, I don't want to see that because I can't evaluate the private credit because I've never done that in my life. And they're a very educated person. And what they do, and I saw that doing, is they buy a bond, a Brazilian bond, go to Jobi Bar, put this behind the desk and start to talking bad about the Brazilian economy, so the bond drop and the yield climb. That's the spirit of doing that. That's why I'm Cajun, because I believe that's a causation. Yeah, that's why that's why they're being always in Leblon. It's the same people, here, especially in Rio de Janeiro. It's the same folk. It's amazing. It's but that's important. I'm going to be as fast as I can. Okay, excuse me. And what happened here? When you drop the yields, you put money in economy. When you put the money in economy, investors start to buy assets. When you start to buy assets, the price climbs, the yield of those assets fall. So make money was you. But again, when you have an economy booming, the unemployment rate drops. When unemployment rate drops, the salary starts to climb. This is a real minimum wage between 1940 and right now. When the salary on the wage climb, the costs climb and the yield or the profit margin drops. What happened here? I highlight some levels here. Here, when the first climbed very fast, the real minimum wage in BRL, Getúlio Vargas suicided himself. When it climbed very fast. It was in the same, a very high level during this period. Then you have the military coup in 1964. It dropped very fast. And then here, that's why I believe it's a consequence of real. Here, it starts to climb again. But then it reached here with the Dilma Rousseff impeachment. Make a long story short, we had here the currency between 2004 and 2016. Here we have Japanese yen, euro, Mexican peso, Sweden corona, krone, franc, and Swiss franc, yes. The orange line is Brazil. This is the currency that most appreciated between 2004 and 2011. It was stronger than the Swiss franc, so to speak. Here is Mexican peso. That expanded a lot to me. If you put this graph, this data, the currency data, with the minimum wage, that's what happened in the same graph, the same points. Look what happened with the real wages in Brazil in US dollars. It skyrocketed. It dropped, it destroyed all the profit margins in Brazil. But I'm telling again, it's not easy to make money, but another thing happened at the same time. Here I'm going to speed that. What happened in Brazil is when you drop the unemployment rate, it means that the salaries of the wages are climbing. When the wages are climbing, something strange happened in the Brazilian economy. If you see the percentage of domestic workers and the housing spending survey, we have inflation, a CPI. You need to make a survey to see what are the elements of the CPI. Household spending is 3% of all the CPI in Brazil, the IPCA. If you have a very developed economy like Denmark and Sweden, it's 0. So when these folks start to be middle class, the inflation starts to boom. And when the inflation starts to boom, what does the central bank need to do to control inflation? Time the Selic rate. So the inflation target system here is somehow the guardian of the status quo of the Brazilian society. And it's more amazing that we have here the ILO, the International Labour Association 2013, released a report about the situation of domestic workers in the world. Brazil has, according to International Labour Association, 13% of all domestic workers in the world. We are a slavery house. We are a very big farm here. That's why what happened is that we can. I'm going to end now. Yeah. That's why you need to understand that it's more difficult than we imagined to drop the Selic rate because we are changing our consensus. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So I was invited to make some quick comments on the presentations. Starting with Andrew's presentation, which is very interesting. As a matter of fact, I'm not make a comment on the presentation itself, but I would like to pose one question. Because you made a very good presentation regarding on the role of FDI and the government strategy that rely on FDI. So, but one thing that we see nowadays, especially when you look at developing countries, is that they rely more and more on accumulated reserves as a way to avoid balance of payment crisis. This has been a trend, clearly a trend. And how do you think it could threaten, the development of Brazil, South Korea, China, so on and so forth? So I think that it connects a lot with the story that you told in the past. So, but what I'm doing is to invite you to make a comment on the years to come. Well, on the Ernani's presentation, I couldn't agree more. And so, again, what I would like to invite you, Ernani, is to think how or if, without BNDES play and decisive role that it used to play in the past, how we could organize the development, the leverage of the firms that yes, we are shown here, we've shown here. So what we saw was a huge leverage of the companies, and the BNDES used to play a role in organizing the development, the leverage process in the recent past. But without BNDES, with a president that thinks that the investors could go anywhere to get credit, but especially in the case nowadays when we are looking for, a way to organize the leverage process. How do you think what could be done under such circumstances? Well, as for André, I confess that I couldn't follow, the main problem with the status quo and the relationship with. But would you say my invitation to you is? Would you say that in the case of Brazil, the reason why we won't succeed, according to your point, is that because the labor cost in Brazil is too high, or it has to do with the orthodox view that you mentioned before, when it emphasizes, the bad management of the fiscal dimension of the country.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Thanks, Rogerio. Now we again. Okay, now Professor Coutinho will give us the summing up of the session with his comments and perhaps his takes on what we should be thinking about, or even better doing.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I should apologize for confirming just very, very short notice, but I did enjoy very much the session this afternoon, the morning session also. Very interesting, so it was a pleasure for me, and I congratulate you and all the organizers, Ana Célia, but particularly you for the putting together all the people that came from abroad. Very Professor Jan Kregel, Professor Wade, Professor Fischer, and other here. Thank you. Let me start by commenting your exposition, Andrew. I think I was wondering whether you read Alice Amsden.
Yeah, no, I mentioned her, yeah.
Oh, you did mention. So it's not. Now, what I would add, because you were reading balance of payment tables and was lacking a historical vision and the understanding that the world changed with globalization and financialization. The table that was presented by Professor Kregel, that it shows how a massive delocalization of production chains were moved to China with globalization. And that's why it's not surprise at all that foreign companies have such an importance in Chinese export surplus. If you take Apple as a simple example, all Apple phones and tablets, etc., are produced, not just assembled, they're produced in China by Foxconn. And Apple has its headquarters not in California, but in some tax haven. So it is multinationals. The world has changed, and you cannot just read those tables, also ignoring the stages of development. I mean, all South Korea, Brazil, China, when they were in process of industrialization, it's entirely different when they had accomplished the industrialization and became powerful. Well, what incapable of maintaining a stable surplus. So that's what I understand from your tables, that they did change at certain point. Now, of course, having the help of foreign finance is a good thing, provided that you keep control and of your destinies, and you have a capable state to direct your development process. So I think that I think you agree with these, that policy matters, and Chinese had a clear vision of its long-term policy. The South Koreans had a vision for the future, and they did had coherence on time, differently from Brazil. In fact, when Brazil had trade surplus, was just because we were in deep economic crisis. That was not a result of a strategy, a policy strategy, not at all, unfortunately. So I think that, and I think you should take out of your presentation that generosity and the stability of official flows, because that's just today, it sounds like a joke. With Trump, I mean, it's not. I'm sorry for. I mean, I think you should take advantage of having done a precious preparation of all those tables to give a historical reading of it, or more emphasis on this. I'm sorry if I misunderstood, but now let's move to Brazil. And I think I think both Ernani and André presented in a very clear way the challenge that we're facing. I can't agree more with Ernani about his. Of course, Ernani was a chief economist of BNDES during my term, and we worked very. Then he left because he retired, but we worked very hard to create the long-term infrastructure bonds. That's just that little component. And unfortunately, because we have such a high interest rates, it's difficult to originate massive. Although it was growing, it's no longer growing. The origination has sunk. And it is a big problem now. And that has to do with the inability to develop the project, to prepare the project, and to put the projects to auctions. So I think we are in. But we do share the idea that there is a potential space for the capital markets to contribute, although we know that capital markets are highly sensitive to cyclical variations, and they are highly pro-cyclical. And that's why, although they may be complementary to development banks, public banks, are an essential institution to developing economies, and it is a privilege for Brazil to have a institution like BNDES. And I regret that BNDES will be shrinking. Its scope and scale of BNDES matters for Brazil. And that's the point you made. Matters not just for supporting investment, but matters for the development of the capital markets, including that I think it's very clear, and I congratulate you for the very, very clear points that you made. And the same, I should congratulate André for pointing very clearly the lack of consistency of the fiscal policy after, and that was also a point made by Felipe and by Laura in the previous, and by Professor Kregel in the previous panel. It is a crazy thing to think that you can help the economy recover by depressing public investment or by depressing effective demand through a forced reduction of expenditures, because revenues are still declining quite steeply. And you're very courageous, André, to showing that some deficit may be necessary in the short term for a transition. And more than ever, an institution like BNDES would be essential for a transition. I think that one big missing maybe conclusion that the panel before could, unfortunately we did have not time for a discussion, but it was clear that we are in a deadlock in Brazil. The economy has no source of expansion, no intrinsic force of expansion. Households are highly indebted and afraid of unemployment. They will not expand. The private sector, the corporate sector is highly indebted. Felipe has shown that clearly, highly indebted. Professor Kregel also, half of the listed companies are unable to serve the debt. So the private sector, with a very few exceptions, will not expand. Idle capacity, huge in many sectors. So there will be no confidence, even if you could pass the reforms, so-called overnight. No? Even if those reforms are counterproductive in terms of the recovery in the short, may be rational in the very long term, the Social Security reform. But even though expenditure would not come, if the public sector cannot spend because of the new law, if states, that is important point, not just the private sector is highly indebted, but also the states of the federation are broke, most of them, and are in deep fiscal crisis. So the fiscal crisis is deepening through the recession. So the only way out of that I can envisage would be, the right question would be how to generate new effective demand in a sizable scale, 1-2% of GDP increase each year in order to stop the spiral, negative spiral of recession, and try to start a recovery would be through investment in infrastructure. And preferably by having the private sector as an agent to do so. But that requires project preparation, requires having the projects ready for auction, etc. There is a stock. I don't know why. We are losing time in inducing a cycle of investment in infrastructure in large scale, including using new ideas, thinking out of the box, like using existing concessions and negotiate more investment now under certain rules, fair rules, negotiated with the agencies, the regulatory agencies, etc., TCU, to have investment. And investment in these, infrastructure investment, is a need for Brazil, is positive in the long term, not in the very short term. In the long term is positive return. It's bottlenecks that the Brazilian economy already have. And the source for financing in the start inevitably would have to be BNDES in large scale to start the process. Later on, if you have lower interest rates, we can have the positive impact of the capital markets coming to help. And I think many ideas, new ideas, the work, we were successful, Ernani, and you were absolutely critical for the formulation of the infrastructure bonds. But you know that it can be improved. It can be improved. The central bank, the Internal Revenue Service, the Receita Federal. So we know where the impediments are for making it more effective. We can make it more powerful. Oh. And then we have a win-win situation in which the capital markets could help the investment in infrastructure and the private sector. So that is the only proposal I see. The other force would be exports, net exports. And I think Professor Marconi has stressed that point. However, I'm not so, I think net exports are important, but they are not as powerful as the investment in infrastructure in the short term because of the global economy. Global trade is anemic. And competition is very fierce. It's difficult. So, but nevertheless, Brazil has transnational companies. We could do much better if we had. And I hope Trump administration will help to devalue the real. I don't think the Brazilian government will do it. It may create some difficulties for the monetary policy, may delay the interest rate. But this is an important, those are the only two forces for recovery. Now, if, I'm finishing, if BNDES is to prepay 100 billion, as Ernani said, the capabilities to launch a big program needed for reversing is under risk. Maybe so. I think I'll go to, it's inevitably to become more pessimistic and be more pessimistic than optimistic. On the other hand, things may deteriorate to such an extent. And I think that we are very close to hit the banks. Non-performing of the banks will come soon. And then maybe the economists, liberal conservative economists, change their minds because their bosses will be at risk. And then the ideas may change, as is changing in many other global economy, because the exhaustion of quantitative easing is already calling for fiscal expansion. Many conservative voices are calling for fiscal expansion in many places. So another important mission for BNDES, and that it's a pity to pay back, would be grant longer grace periods for existing, give some relief in credit, rollover with longer grace period through the banking system, help the banking system to maintain its healthy situation. Avoid massive delinquency that would be another important thing for the bank. It's not a noble mission, but it is necessary mission. A noble mission is to support investment and innovation. That's our dream. But it is the mission that's needed in the short term. I'm sorry, I was trying to sum up the previous panel and this panel.
You did a very good job.
And I thank you for the invitation again. Apologize for Professor Andrew for the observations. That,
No.
They
I have
were,
the right to respond, right?
right. Maybe, sure.
No, please, no, not right away.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thanks a lot. I think Luciano did a great job in summing up the sessions, and I think the panels were great. The only flaw that I think I committed is that there were too many interesting interventions, which means we hardly have time for discussion today. But we will have more discussions tomorrow, because tomorrow we still have sessions, and we will have the whole afternoon more or less trying to get into a more general conversation about the themes that were debated yesterday and today. So what I will do is to invite you to come back tomorrow and have more time for a more general and more in-depth discussion of several themes that were left open today. So in a way, I apologize for doing that, but on the other hand, I do know that every one of you and maybe the panel were aiming for maybe a cerveja or a shop or something the likes. So thank you so much, and we will resume tomorrow morning. Thanks. Thank you for the panel.